Snow came down in sheets, slanting through the pines as if heaven itself had torn open a sack of ashes. The mountains groaned under the storm, their ridges vanishing into pale nothingness. Within the log cabin set against a rocky bluff, a single fire burned. The glow painted the walls in restless orange, shadows crawling like silent companions across rough-hewn logs. Inside sat a man, bare-chested beneath a wool blanket, shoulders broad as timber beams, hair long and black, spilling loose down his back. Tawa Greyhawk had grown used to silence. Years had taught him its weight, its strange comfort. The wind howled, but it did not break the quiet inside him. His eyes, dark and unblinking, fixed on the fire as though it could tell him truths no human mouth ever had. He had not spoken aloud in days. There was no one left to speak to. Outside, the storm gathered itself into a frenzy. Snow and sleet mixed, each gust slamming against the cabin as if to remind him of the world's hostility. He stirred only to place another log on the fire. His breath rose in plumes, chest muscles flexing beneath the shifting light, scars visible like pale rivers across his skin. Each mark a memory, settlers, raids, betrayals, but he wore them as if they belonged to someone else now, someone who had died when he chose solitude. Then, through the storm, came a sound that was not wind. A knock. It was faint at first, lost in the roar of snow against wood. Then again, louder, insistent, desperate. Tawa rose slowly, towering in the dim cabin. His hand brushed the rifle leaning by the hearth, instinct alive even after years without need. Silence returned, save for the crackle of fire. For a long moment he thought it was only storm madness, the imagination playing tricks in loneliness. But then a voice, thin, breaking, cut through. "Please." Tawa's eyes narrowed. He moved to the door, every step deliberate, weighty. The wood groaned as he drew back the bar. Cold knife through as he pulled it open. Snow swirling inside like ghosts breaking entry. Two figures stood there, cloaked in white, hair plastered wet against their cheeks. Women, young, yet their faces bore the exhaustion of winters survived without kindness. One clutched the other's arm, steadying her against the wind. Their dresses were torn from travel, soaked to the bone, shawls little more than rags under the weight of snow. The taller one, auburn-haired, lifted her chin despite trembling lips. Pride burned through her weariness. But it was the quieter one who spoke, her voice nearly swallowed by the storm. "Can we stay one night?" The words drifted into his chest heavier than any snow. For years no voice but his own had crossed this threshold. Settlers feared him, shunned him, cursed his name in town. Now two of them stood begging entry, as though the wilderness had driven them to his exile. Tawa said nothing. His silence was the only language left to him, and he watched how it pressed on them. The auburn-haired one stiffened beneath it, eyes flashing as though she would rather freeze than beg again. The other lowered her gaze, lashes wet with melting snow, humility carrying what pride could not. Finally, Tawa stepped aside. The taller one hesitated, suspicion plain, but the storm behind her shoved her forward. They crossed into the cabin, trailing snow, clutching each other for warmth. He shut the door and dropped the bar, the sound echoing like judgment. For a moment, all three only breathed. Their breaths mingled in the small cabin, human presence unfamiliar and disquieting. Tawa returned to the fire, sitting without a word. The women huddled near the doorway at first, not trusting the shadowed giant who had admitted them. The auburn-haired one broke the silence with a strained voice. "We'll leave when the storm eases. We don't need charity." He did not answer. He did not need to. Her words were armor, as his silence was shield. He fed another log into the flames, the crackle speaking more than he could offer. The quieter one, cheeks hollow with hunger, whispered a soft thank you. She drew her shawl tighter, guiding her sister closer to the warmth. They stretched pale hands toward the fire, trembling fingers opening like flowers too long denied sun. Time passed in small movements. The smell of wet wool filled the cabin. Melted snow pooled around their skirts. Tawa rose once, ladling stew from a pot over the hearth into a wooden bowl. He set it near them without looking, then returned to his chair. Hunger triumphed over pride. They ate, hands shaking, spoons clattering against wood. In that silence, something shifted. Tawa watched them, though not openly, studying how the auburn-haired one tried to hide her gratitude behind narrowed eyes, while the other let her tears fall freely, steam rising from her cheeks as warmth returned. He felt something stir he had thought long buried: recognition. They, too, were outcasts in some way. The storm had driven them here, yes, but perhaps judgment had driven them long before. The fire roared, growing hotter. Their faces softened in its light. The cabin, once a tomb of solitude, became heavy with the sound of others breathing, shifting, whispering prayers under their breath. Tawa sat still, but inside him old wounds ached as though thawing in dangerous ways. The auburn-haired one caught him staring once and held his gaze. Her defiance trembled on the edge of breaking. Yet beneath it was a question unspoken, one he had heard long ago in many forms. Could they trust him? He looked away, unwilling to answer, because trust was a bridge burned for him. When night deepened, the storm's rage only grew. The walls groaned, snow slamming against the cabin as though it would bury them alive. The women lay on the floor near the fire, shawls spread, huddled together. Their breaths grew slow, steadier, exhaustion dragging them into sleep. Tawa did not sleep. He watched. He listened. And as he watched, he realized it had been years since he had heard the rhythm of another's rest within his walls. The sound of two women breathing was as foreign to him as laughter. Yet it filled the cabin with a fragile warmth the fire alone could not give. The storm howled outside, louder than before, but inside a new silence grew, one layered not with emptiness, but with questions. Who were they? Why had they come here? And what weight of rejection had driven them to his door? He sat long into the night, eyes fixed not on the fire, but on the fragile shapes curled by it, snow melting from their hair, steam rising faintly into the air. His chest tightened with something he dared not name. At last, the flames burned low, leaving only embers to glow red across the floor. Tawa leaned back against the wall, broad frame shadowed. And in the hush that followed, he knew this storm had carried more than snow to his door. It had carried a change he could not turn away. For years, no one had knocked. And now, as the two women slept within his walls, Tawa Greyhawk understood the silence of his life would never sound the same again. Morning crept in muted gray, the storm having eased into a steady hush of falling snow. The cabin smelled of ash and boiled meat, smoke clinging to the rafters. Elsie Mayfield stirred first, auburn hair tangled against her cheek, eyes flicking open with the wary sharpness of someone long trained not to trust a roof freely given. She sat up slowly, glancing at her sister Evelyn, who still slept curled like a child, her face softened at last by warmth. Across the room, Tawa Greyhawk had not moved. He sat where he had kept watch through the night, back against the wall, head tilted as though he might be sleeping, but his eyes opened the moment Elsie's weight shifted on the floorboards. He rose with the deliberate quiet of a man used to hunting in silence, stepping past them to stoke the fire. Sparks leapt, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers held suspicion. His revealed nothing. "We won't trouble you longer than we must," Elsie said, her voice rough from cold and pride. She pulled her shawl tight, straightening her shoulders as though dignity might be stitched into the fabric. Evelyn stirred, sitting up slowly. She glanced between them, reading the air with gentler eyes. "The storm's not past yet," she whispered, her voice like fragile glass. Tawa said nothing. He set a pot over the fire, the smell of venison stew rising. His silence pressed heavier than words, yet it was not cruel. It was the silence of someone who had learned how little words could shield a heart. As they ate, Elsie kept her chin lifted, but hunger betrayed her. Spoon scraped bowl, as if to say she was not too proud to survive. Evelyn murmured thanks again, her eyes lowering each time she spoke, as though gratitude itself was a dangerous offering. The hours passed. Snow piled deeper at the door, wind sighing against the logs. Inside, small gestures began to draw invisible threads between them. Evelyn picked up his blanket where it had fallen from the chair, folded it neatly, and placed it near him. Elsie, though stiff with mistrust, quietly swept water pooled by the hearth from their melting skirts. Tawa returned from the door with fresh wood, setting it down by the fire, his movements careful not to startle. No words passed, but the air shifted, slow and fragile as the thaw of ice on spring rivers. Yet beneath that fragile warmth, Elsie's thoughts gnawed like wolves. She knew what the town would say. Two women taking shelter with an Apache giant in the wilderness. It would be scandal enough to blacken them beyond repair. Already, whispers trailed them wherever they went. Too old for spinsterhood, too pretty for decency, too poor to be worth marrying. She could hear the hiss of those voices in her skull, carried on phantom winds from the town she despised yet could never fully escape. Evelyn, too, felt the sting of memory. Only months ago, Mrs. Lorne had leaned across a church pew, whispering loud enough for all to hear. "No man will take them in, mark my words. Shame follows where they go." Evelyn had wept that night, while Elsie had clenched her jaw so hard she thought her teeth would crack. Now here they were, in the cabin of a man townsfolk called Savage, their survival depending on him. Tawa felt the weight of those same whispers, though he had not heard them spoken in years. He remembered every narrowed eye, every muttered curse, how settlers spat on the ground when he passed. He had left the town because their hatred left no room for him to breathe. Now the daughters of that same world sat in his cabin, needing what he offered, yet half afraid of him. Their presence was a wound reopening, old salt poured fresh. By afternoon, Elsie tried to leave. She rose, gathering her shawl, muttering that the storm had eased enough. Tawa stood, broad shoulders filling the doorway as he barred it with a single arm. His face revealed no anger, only certainty. He gestured to the swirl outside, snow rising in drifts higher than a horse's flank. Elsie faltered, her pride crumbling into reluctant surrender. Evelyn touched her sister's arm. "We can't, not yet," she whispered, voice trembling. "He's right." Elsie's throat tightened with the bitterness of being forced to stay, yet she said nothing. Instead, she returned to the fire, sitting rigid, eyes hard, as though every moment in that cabin was an indictment against her name. Evening came, shadows lengthening across the floor. Tawa returned from the storm, shoulders dusted in white, laying down a hare he had snared. He cleaned it in silence, his knife glinting in firelight. Elsie watched him with wary eyes, both unsettled and begrudgingly relieved by his skill. Evelyn, unable to resist her gentle nature, offered to help. She plucked feathers, hands trembling but determined, glancing up shyly at the giant whose presence filled the cabin. For the first time his gaze softened, a flicker of respect passing between them like an ember catching flame. As night deepened, silence stretched taut. Elsie could not hold her thoughts inside any longer. She spoke, her voice cutting through the crackle of firewood. "They'll talk about us, you know. If word gets out, they'll say we had no shame." Her jaw clenched, the word shame spat like poison. Evelyn lowered her gaze, tears pricking her lashes. "Let them talk." Tawa looked at them, expression unreadable. He did not know how to ease their fear, for he had no practice at easing his own. Instead, he reached to the fire, placing another log across the flames. The sparks rose, casting fleeting stars against the cabin's roof. Outside, wind carried faint echoes, hooves, perhaps, distant against frozen ground. Elsie's body stiffened, listening hard. Tawa's head turned, every muscle alert. The storm swallowed the sound again, but unease lingered. Evelyn whispered, "Did you hear?" "Riders," Elsie breathed, her voice sharp with dread. Tawa said nothing. He crossed the cabin, pulling the rifle from its place by the wall, checking it with slow precision. His silence was not emptiness this time, but readiness. Elsie's breath caught, her heart torn between fear of him and fear of what might be coming. In that moment, Evelyn reached for his arm, her small hand trembling against his scarred skin. "Thank you," she whispered, though no one had asked for gratitude. Her eyes were wide, clear, unafraid. Tawa froze, startled by the touch. He had forgotten the weight of a gentle hand, forgotten how it could still him more than any weapon. The firelight flickered, wind howled, and in the heavy pause that followed, the shape of their conflict grew clearer. They were three souls bound by storms, not only of snow, but of gossip, judgment, and the long exile of being unwanted. Outside, the night pressed close. Far down the valley, a lantern bobbed faintly through the trees, then vanished. Perhaps a trick of wind, Perhaps not. But in the silence that followed, Elsie felt the weight of the world closing in, gossip sharpening into something more dangerous. Evelyn lay down near the fire, clutching her shawl, her breath soft. Elsie stayed upright, her eyes never leaving the rifle in Tawa's hands. The giant sat across from her, face shadowed, his stillness as unnerving as it was reassuring. When the last ember cracked and broke, she whispered to herself as much as to him, "They'll come for us." He did not answer. But in the silence, she felt the truth of it settle like snow upon her chest. And somewhere beyond the storm, the faint sound of hooves returned. Closer this time, steady as judgment riding through the dark. Snow lay heavy across the valley by dawn, a white shroud muting every sound, but the groan of pines bending under its weight. The cabin stood like a lone ember in the wilderness, smoke rising faintly from its chimney into the gray sky. Inside, warmth lingered, fragile as breath against glass. Elsie sat near the fire, awake long before her sister, her gaze fixed on the rifle propped beside the giant Apache. Tawa Greyhawk had not moved from his chair. His eyes had followed the night, alert to every shift in wind, every distant echo that might have been hooves. She had not spoken to him, but her silence was laced with questions she dared not voice. Evelyn stirred, murmuring softly in her sleep before waking with a shiver. Her first glance went not to the window or storm, but to Tawa. A faint smile broke through the weariness of her face, like sunlight on thawing snow. Elsie envied and feared that softness, for she knew what dangers kindness could bring when placed in the wrong hands. The day passed in small rhythms. Tawa left without a word, vanishing into the snowbound woods with bow and knife. His tracks disappeared quickly under the storm's drift. Elsie felt exposed in his absence, yet when he returned at dusk, shoulders burdened with a deer across them, she felt relief she could not name. He laid the carcass down by the door, breath fogging in the cold, and for the first time spoke since they arrived. "Eat," he said simply, voice deep, roughened by years of disuse. The words startled them, heavy as if carved from stone. Evelyn bowed her head in thanks, her hands already moving to help with what she could. Elsie sat stiff, though hunger gnawed her pride. She forced herself to join, skin prickling each time her hand brushed near his. By evening, the cabin smelled of roasting meat, rich and heavy. The sisters ate, their bellies warming with something more than food. Tawa ate little, watching them more than the flames. His silence no longer carried only distance. It carried a weight of unspoken questions, of memories stirring. When the plates were empty, Evelyn quietly gathered them, and cleaned them with snow packed from a bucket by the door. Tawa's eyes followed her small, careful movements. For a moment, he seemed less a man of stone, and more a man remembering what home might have once felt like. Elsie saw it too and felt a pang, sharp and confusing. She had sworn never to lean on a man again, not after the cold way suitors had looked through her in town, not after being judged and dismissed for what she lacked. Yet here she was, her sister softening in the shadow of an Apache outlaw, while her own resolve bent under the weight of survival. That night, as the storm eased and moonlight seeped pale through the shutter cracks, Tawa repaired a broken chair leg near the fire. His large hands, calloused and scarred, worked with a precision that felt almost tender. Evelyn sat near, stitching a tear in his blanket. She hummed faintly under her breath, a tune from their childhood, the sound filling the space like a fragile thread binding them all. Elsie listened, torn between irritation and longing. The sight of her sister sewing for him, offering the small domestic kindness usually reserved for kin, unsettled her. She whispered sharply, "Evelyn, enough." Evelyn's needle paused. "It's nothing, Elsie. He needs it mended." Elsie's gaze cut to Tawa, expecting anger, but he said nothing. He looked at Evelyn only once, a flicker of respect passing in his eyes, then returned to his work. Elsie's throat tightened. She wanted to call it foolish, dangerous, but something inside her recognized the truth. Evelyn had already chosen to see him as more than the town's whispers, more than the ghost of his own exile. The days blurred into each other, storm following storm. They fell into rhythm. Tawa hunted, Elsie kept the hearth, Evelyn sewed or cleaned. Small acts of grace multiplied like unseen seeds. Bread shared first with him. A chair moved closer to the fire when one shivered, a coat draped quietly across shoulders in the night. They spoke little, yet the silence grew different. It was no longer emptiness, but the fragile hearth of three souls learning to endure together. Still, shadows of the town pressed close. Each time Elsie glanced at the rifle, she saw in her mind the faces of Sheriff Amos and Hattie Lorne, voices hissing about shame and ruin. She knew the world would never forgive what was unfolding inside this cabin. Survival had brought them here, but gossip would follow them like wolves, tearing at dignity until nothing was left. One evening, as firelight licked the walls, Elsie confronted him. Her voice shook with more than anger. "Why did you let us in? You know what they'll say. You know what they'll do if they find us here." Tawa looked at her, gaze unflinching, dark eyes reflecting flames. "Storm does not ask name," he said, words halting but certain. "Storm only kills." The answer struck deeper than she expected. She wanted to argue, to remind him that townsfolk's hatred could cut sharper than snow, but her throat closed. Evelyn touched her hand, whispering, "Elsie, he saved us." The truth lay heavy in the cabin, undeniable. He had. That night, Elsie could not sleep. She watched Tawa where he sat against the wall, the firelight cutting his profile into something both fierce and strangely human. Her chest ached with contradictions, fear, gratitude, shame, and an unspoken curiosity about the man who had chosen silence over vengeance, solitude over bitterness. The next morning, the sound returned. Hooves, distant but real this time, echoing across the valley like a warning bell. Tawa rose before the sisters could react, moving to the door. Elsie's pulse quickened, dread clawing at her ribs. She rushed to the window, lifting the edge of a frost-rimmed shutter. Through swirling snow, she saw it. A rider moving slow along the ridge, lantern swinging at his side. The shape was unmistakable. Sheriff Amos. Elsie's breath caught. The world she had tried to leave behind had found her, even here. She turned to Tawa, who stood still as stone, rifle in hand. Evelyn clutched her shawl, eyes wide, trembling not from cold but from the truth seeping in. The fragile hearth they had built was no longer hidden. It burned now beneath the gaze of judgment, and the storm outside seemed gentler than the storm that would soon arrive at their door. The knock came not from the storm this time but from men. It was deliberate, heavy, the kind that announced authority rather than pleaded for mercy. The sound cut through the cabin like an axe splitting wood. Elsie froze where she stood, her fingers still clutching the window shutter. Evelyn gasped, retreating toward the fire as though its glow could shield her. Tawa did not flinch. He set the rifle aside, but kept his body between the women and the door. For a long heartbeat, the only sounds were the hiss of the fire, and the muffled snorts of horses outside. Then the knock came again, louder. "Tawa Greyhawk," a voice boomed, roughened with years of command. "Sheriff Amos. Open your door. You know why we're here." Evelyn's hand found Elsie's. Her grip trembled, soft as a bird's wing. Elsie straightened her shoulders, pride rising sharp even as dread filled her chest. She whispered, "Don't open it." But Tawa moved. His steps were slow, deliberate, like a man walking into battle he had expected all along. He lifted the bar from the door and swung it wide. Cold wind swept in, carrying the smell of sweat, wet leather and tobacco. 4 men stood on the snow-packed ground, lantern light flickering across their faces. Sheriff Amos at the front, his jaw set hard, gray eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him were ranch hands and townsmen, rifles slung across their shoulders. And just to the side, wrapped in a heavy shawl, stood Hattie Lorne. Her lips curled in that familiar sneer, eyes sharp with the satisfaction of judgment. "Well," Amos drawled, scanning the cabin's interior. His gaze lingered on Elsie and Evelyn by the fire. "Seems the rumors weren't just rumors after all." Hattie's voice pierced the night like a needle. 2 young women shacked up with an Apache savage in the mountains. Lord have mercy, if their poor parents could see them now. She clucked her tongue, shaking her head as if pity softened the cruelty in her words. Elsie's cheeks burned hot. She wanted to shout, to curse, to spit the venom back. But her throat closed under the weight of those eyes, those voices that had followed her since girlhood, whispering she was never enough. Evelyn pressed closer, whispering, "Don't listen. Don't." Tawa said nothing. He stood tall in the doorway, long hair whipping in the wind, chest bare beneath the blanket, scars gleaming like pale rivers. His silence seemed to unnerve even Amos, who shifted slightly in his boots before speaking again. "We've come for the women," the sheriff said. "They don't belong here. You know it as well as I do." "No," Evelyn whispered, surprising herself. Her voice was thin but carried across the room. "We're not leaving." Hattie barked a bitter laugh. "Hear that? The poor lamb thinks she's got a choice. Honey, staying here will mark you ruined. No decent soul will touch you after this." Elsie finally found her voice. It cracked but did not falter. "Decent souls never touched us before, Hattie. What difference would it make now?" The words hung heavy, shocking even Evelyn. Amos's jaw tightened. "It makes all the difference, Elsie Mayfield. Your name's your dignity. They're worth more than freezing in this outlaw's den." He looked at Tawa, his voice sharpening. "And you, best let them come. You've no right keeping them." Tawa's eyes darkened, though his voice remained even when he finally spoke. "Storm brought them. I did not." "Storm won't shield them from gossip," Hattie hissed. "Or from sin." The cabin seemed to shrink under the weight of judgment pressing against its walls. Elsie's heart pounded. She saw her sister's tears glistening in the firelight, saw the townsmen gripping their rifles, saw Tawa standing unyielding, scarred chest bare to the winter air. In that moment, she realized the choice before her was not only about survival. It was about what life they would claim, what dignity they would defend. She rose, her knees trembling but her spine straight. "This place is no shame to me," she said, her voice low yet steady. "He gave us warmth when no one else would. That's more than I can say for the town." Evelyn's hand clutched hers tight, as though her sister's words gave her courage too. Tears fell silently down her cheeks, but her chin lifted in quiet agreement. Amos shifted, torn between the law he claimed to uphold and the raw truth in Elsie's voice. Behind him, Hattie scoffed loudly, covering discomfort with cruelty. "You've lost your minds. Both of you. Better to rot respectable than live like this." But neither sister moved toward the door. Tawa's eyes flickered, watching them. Something deep and long buried shifted in him, a flicker of respect, of kinship. For years he had carried silence like armor, bearing shame not his own. Now he saw it mirrored in these women, and for the first time, he was not alone in it. Amos blew out a long breath, glancing at the men beside him. "Let's go," he muttered finally. "No dragging women out by force tonight. But mark me, this isn't over." Hattie spat into the snow, muttering curses as they turned back to their horses. Lanterns bobbed in the storm as their shapes disappeared into the dark. The door closed, the bar slid back into place. The silence that followed was not empty. It pulsed with the echo of words spoken, choices made. The sisters still stood hand in hand, breaths shaking. Tawa turned from the door, his face unreadable in the firelight. Elsie met his gaze, uncertain whether to expect anger or gratitude. Instead, she found something quieter, acknowledgement, perhaps even respect. Her chest ached under its weight. Evelyn leaned against her shoulder, exhausted, whispering, "We stayed." The fire crackled, filling the stillness. Shame still pressed heavy, but for the first time it felt shared, not borne alone. The fragile hearth they had built had held against judgment, for now. Yet Elsie knew the town would not let go so easily. The memory of Amos's voice lingered like a shadow in her mind. "This isn't over." And as the flames burned low, she realized that what had begun with a knock of desperation now stood at the edge of something far more dangerous. The fight not only for survival, but for the right to belong in a world determined to cast them out. The storm returned with fury, wind shrieking through the valley, snow swirling so thick it seemed the world itself was dissolving. The cabin groaned beneath the weight of it, firelight flickering against walls that felt thinner than ever. Elsie sat with her sister close, hands clasped tight, their breaths shallow as if holding on to air might hold off what was coming. For they all knew, the town would not leave matters unfinished. Tawa Greyhawk stood near the door, every muscle rigid, listening as though he could hear more than the storm. His face was carved in shadow, unreadable, but his eyes burned with a quiet resolve. He had lived through storms before, both of weather and of men, but this one carried more than his own survival in its teeth. Behind him, 2 women who had come as strangers now waited, their lives tangled with his in ways no one could untangle without blood or sacrifice. The first sound came faintly, hooves, muffled by snow. Then voices, rough and carried by the gale. Lanterns appeared through the white, bobbing like ghostly stars. Elsie's chest tightened. Evelyn's hand gripped her sleeve. The men had returned. A hard knock rattled the door. No patience this time, no pretense of negotiation. The wood shuddered as fists and rifle butts struck it again and again. A voice roared, "Open up, Greyhawk, or we'll take the door down." Tawa looked at the sisters. Elsie's heart pounded, but she shook her head. Evelyn whispered, "Please," though even she could not finish the plea. The Apache giant turned back to the door, drawing the rifle into his hands. He moved without hurry, as if every action carried the weight of years, as though violence were a language he had sworn not to speak but still remembered fluently. He set himself between the door and the women, as solid as the logs of the cabin. The door cracked open under the pounding, snow gusting inside. Sheriff Amos shoved through first, face raw with cold, eyes harder than before. Behind him came 3 men with rifles raised. Hattie Lorne had not come this time. Gossip had done its work, and now the law carried the weight of judgment. "This ends tonight," Amos said, breath fogging. His gaze shifted to Elsie and Evelyn, who clung together by the fire. "You're coming back with us. Both of you. We won't watch you throw your lives away in this shame." Elsie rose, trembling but fierce. "Shame doesn't live here, Sheriff. Only warmth." Her voice cracked, but the words did not falter. Evelyn nodded, tears streaking her cheeks, whispering, "We're staying." The sheriff's jaw hardened. "Then we'll drag you out." He stepped forward, but Tawa moved faster. His rifle lifted, not fired, but held with such force that even hardened men paused. His voice came low, steady, each word carrying the weight of silence broken. "No one leaves here against their will." The air thickened, fire snapping, snow whirling through the open door. Amos's men shifted, uncertain, their rifles trembling between law and survival. They had heard stories of Greyhawk, how he fought like storm and fire, how he walked away from battles no man should survive. To test him here in his own den seemed a fool's task, yet pride burned in their eyes. Elsie felt her throat tighten. Every second seemed carved from stone, heavy and fragile. She wanted to scream for them to stop, for someone to yield, but her body locked in place. Evelyn pressed her face to her shoulder, praying without words. Then Amos lifted his rifle. The storm roared louder, as though the mountains themselves cried out. Tawa stepped forward, the floor creaking beneath his weight. "I bled enough for men's hate," he said, voice rough but strong. "No more." He shifted the rifle, not toward them but upward, and fired into the beams above. The crack split the cabin, thunder rolling. Snow from the roof fell in heavy sheets past the open door, lantern light smothered, horses panicking outside. The men flinched, rifles half lowered. Amos swore, but his face betrayed doubt. Against the storm, against this man who would not bend, their righteousness faltered. Elsie seized the moment, stepping forward though her legs shook. She planted herself beside Tawa, chin lifted, eyes bright with fire. "We're not leaving," she said, voice ringing truer than it ever had. "If you want to drag us, you'll drag us over his body and mine." Evelyn's voice rose behind her, soft but certain. "And mine." The sheriff's men shifted, unease rippling like wind across wheat. This was no longer law, it was spectacle. To strike down women who stood beside a man they called savage would stain them darker than the gossip they claimed to protect. Amos lowered his rifle slowly. His lips pressed tight, his pride bleeding away in silence. He looked once more at Tawa, who stood unmoved, broad chest rising and falling, eyes steady as stone. Finally, the sheriff spat into the snow. "You've chosen your ruin." He turned sharply, motioning his men out. Lanterns bobbed again, swallowed by storm. The sound of hooves faded into the night until only wind remained. The door shut. The bar slid back into place. Silence fell heavy, thicker than before, yet different. Elsie's body shook, tears spilling at last. Evelyn clung to her, sobbing with relief. The fire glowed low, casting faint halos around their faces. Tawa set the rifle aside and stood still, as though carved from the logs themselves. Then slowly he looked at them, really looked, as if seeing them not as intruders or burdens, but as something else, something chosen. His lips parted, voice rough, breaking like thawing ice. "You are home now," he said. The words fell into the silence like a vow. Elsie's tears deepened, not from fear but from the strange weight of belonging she had never felt before. Evelyn smiled faintly through her sobs, leaning against her sister. Outside, the storm howled, erasing tracks, smothering the valley in snowlight. Inside, three souls sat bound not by shame but by choice, the fragile hearth no longer fragile at all. And though Elsie knew the town would not forgive, she also knew this. They had built something here in defiance of every whisper, every cruel gaze. Dignity found not in approval, but in standing together when the world demanded they bow. The fire snapped once, sparks rising like stars. In that glow, the storm seemed less a curse than a witness. For years, no one had knocked. But now within these walls, they had chosen each other. And nothing beyond the door could ever undo it.